I'm Mia Thompson, 26 years old, and I spent most of my life believing I was the family. Disappointment. While my sister Rachel excelled at everything she touched, I seemed to stumble through life collecting second-place finishes and half-hearted compliments. For years, I accepted my role as the lesser daughter, the one who would never quite measure up to the golden child everyone adored. But there comes a moment when enough is enough, when the person you've looked up to your entire life reveals who they really are. That moment came for me at my own wedding when my father, the respected high school principal who taught me about integrity and responsibility, stood up in front of 85 guests and said something so devastating that I realized everything I thought I knew about him was a lie. What I discovered that day about the man who raised me would destroy his career, shock our community, and finally give me the courage to speak a truth that had been hidden in our family for years. But to understand how we got to that moment, I need to take you back to the beginning. Growing up on Maple Street in our modest 2-story house, I learned early that second place was my permanent address. While Rachel effortlessly sailed through advanced placement courses at Riverside High, I struggled to maintain a B average in regular classes. When she captained the debate team to state championships, I managed to make JV soccer and rode the bench most of the season. My father, Dan Thompson, served as principal at Roosevelt High School across town. You'd think an educator would understand that children develop at different paces, but Dan saw only results. Every parent-teacher conference became a comparison session. Mrs. Anderson would diplomatically explain my mediocre performance in algebra while Dad nodded grimly, already formulating his car ride lecture about applying myself like Rachel did at my age. Rachel maintained a perfect 4.0 GPA throughout high school while juggling student council president, duties debate team, captain responsibilities, and volunteer work at Riverside General Hospital. Meanwhile, I barely scraped together a 3.2 average despite hours of studying that left my eyes burning and my confidence shattered. Art class offered my only refuge. In that cluttered room filled with easels and the sharp smell of turpentine, I discovered something I could actually do well. My paintings caught the attention of Ms. Rodriguez, who encouraged me to enter local competitions. When I won first place at the Riverside County Art Fair, I rushed home with my blue ribbon bursting with pride. Mom glanced up from folding laundry, smiled briefly, and said, "That's nice, honey. Did you hear Rachel got accepted to USC Law School with a full scholarship?" That moment crystallized everything. My achievements would always be footnotes to Rachel's headlines. The scholarship announcements became particularly painful rituals. Rachel received full ride offers from USC, Stanford, and Berkeley, ultimately choosing USC Law. The celebration dinner lasted 4 hours with extended family, calling to congratulate our family genius. When my acceptance letter from Art Center College of Design arrived, Mom opened it with visible disappointment. "Well," she sighed, "at least you're continuing your education." Though Rachel always said art school serves more as personal enrichment than career preparation, I tried desperately to find my niche throughout high school. Drama club seemed promising until Mom missed my lead role performance in our town to attend Rachel's mock trial competition. Track and field looked like an option until Dad casually mentioned that Rachel had been offered athletic scholarships too, though she obviously chose academic excellence instead. Even my artistic abilities, consistently praised by teachers, became another source of comparison. When I won that county fair blue ribbon, Dad's response was lukewarm at best. "Art is a lovely hobby," he said, not looking up from his newspaper, "but Rachel's internship at Henderson & Associates will look much better on college applications. You should consider more practical pursuits." The pattern continued relentlessly through graduation. Rachel delivered the valedictorian speech while I sat in the middle of our graduating class, invisible and unremarkable. During the reception afterward, relatives gathered around Rachel asking about her law school plans and praising her achievements. I stood near the punch bowl, largely ignored, except for occasional polite inquiries about my plans for fall. Our family photos reflected this hierarchy perfectly. The living room mantelpiece displayed Rachel's graduation picture, prominently, surrounded by various award certificates and newspaper clippings about her achievements. My school photos were relegated to a small frame tucked behind Rachel's debate team trophy. Rachel's departure for USC created temporary reprieve from constant comparisons, but Dad found ways to continue the pattern. Weekly phone calls with Rachel became family events. Dad would put calls on the speaker, ensuring I heard every detail about her academic successes, impressive professors, and networking opportunities with future Supreme Court justices. After graduation, Rachel's career trajectory continued its upward climb. She landed a position at Chen & Associates, one of San Diego's most prestigious law firms, starting at a salary that tripled my freelance design income. Her business cards bore impressive titles, and her cases occasionally made local news headlines. Dad collected these newspaper clippings religiously, creating a scrapbook dedicated to Rachel's professional triumphs. Meanwhile, I built my own career path, taking evening classes in digital marketing and web design to expand my skill set. These efforts went largely unnoticed by Dad, who seemed unable to recognize achievements that didn't mirror Rachel's traditional success markers. When I received my first major corporate design contract and a significant income boost, Dad's response was predictable. "That's wonderful, dear. Did you hear Rachel made senior associate? She's the youngest in her firm's history." My personal life became another source of comparison ammunition. Rachel's relationship with Michael Hayes represented everything Dad valued in a partnership. Michael worked as an investment banker, owned a downtown San Diego condo, and came from a family of financial professionals. Their courtship was featured in the San Diego Society pages, complete with photos from charity galas and fundraising dinners. My dating life, in contrast, consisted of relationships with creative professionals, teachers, and small business owners who Dad considered nice enough but not really going anywhere financially. Every relationship ended the same way, with Dad's subtle undermining gradually eroding my confidence until I began seeing my partners through his critical lens. Rachel's wedding to Michael had been a spectacular affair. 200 guests, an $80,000 budget, and coverage in the lifestyle section of the San Diego Union-Tribune. Dad had been so proud, walking Rachel down the aisle of the historic Mission San Juan Capistrano while I stood as maid of honor, smiling and applauding my sister's perfect day. Now at 26, I was finally building something of my own. My freelance graphic design business was thriving, specializing in wedding designs and branding for local businesses. I had a steady income, creative fulfillment, and for the first time in my life, a sense of professional identity that belonged entirely to me. That's when I met Alex Martinez. Alex walked into my life on a Tuesday afternoon at Riverside High's faculty meeting. I was there to present design concepts for their new website, and he was the young music teacher who asked thoughtful questions about accessibility and user experience. Most people glazed over during technical presentations, but Alex leaned forward, genuinely interested in how design could better serve students and families. After the meeting, he approached my display table where I'd set up examples of my work. Unlike the polite nods I usually received, Alex studied each piece carefully, asking about my creative process and the stories behind different projects. "This wedding invitation series is incredible," he said, holding up my portfolio. "You can actually feel the couple's personality in the design. That's rare. And for the first time in years, someone saw my work without immediately comparing it to Rachel's." Legal briefs. Alex Martinez was 27, taught general music, and directed the school choir. His parents, Carlos and Linda, had immigrated from Guadalajara when Alex was 5. Carlos worked as a construction supervisor for Martinez Brothers, construction a company he'd built with his older brother. Linda had recently retired from 30 years as a registered nurse at Riverside Community Hospital. The Martinez family welcomed me with a warmth I'd never experienced. Sunday dinners at their modest house on Orange Grove Avenue became weekly traditions. Linda would cook massive spreads of homemade tamales, carnitas, and fresh tortillas, while Carlos told stories about building custom homes throughout Riverside County. They asked about my business, remembered my client names, and celebrated every small victory without comparing me to anyone else. The contrast with Thompson family dinners was striking, where my parents discussed Rachel's cases and Michael's investment strategies. The Martinez family talked about community involvement, family traditions, and supporting each other's dreams. When Alex mentioned my latest website design project, Carlos would pound the table with enthusiasm. "Mija, you're an artist, show us on the computer." My business partnership with Jessica Chen developed naturally during this period. Jessica ran Riverside's premier wedding planning company, Chen Events, and we'd collaborated on several projects. A Taiwanese-American dynamo with an MBA from UC Irvine, Jessica understood the challenges of building a creative business in a conservative community. "Your designs are getting major attention," Jessica told me over coffee at our usual spot downtown. "I have 3 couples specifically requesting you after seeing the Morrison wedding invitations. We should formalize this partnership." Dad's reaction to my growing success remained predictably dismissive. When I mentioned landing a $15,000 contract to rebrand a local restaurant chain, he barely looked up from his evening news. That's nice, Mia. Rachel just told me she's being considered for partner track. At her age, that's virtually unprecedented in corporate law. Alex witnessed one of these interactions during a family barbecue that fall. I'd excitedly shared news about my biggest contract yet, designing marketing materials for a new shopping center development. Mom seemed genuinely pleased, asking questions about the timeline and creative process. But Dad's response followed the familiar pattern. It's good you're keeping busy with your projects, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. Rachel's workload is incredible right now. She's handling 3 major corporate mergers simultaneously. Her billable hours are through the roof. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Alex's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he remained quiet, squeezing my hand under the table. Later, as we walked to his car, Alex's controlled anger finally surfaced. Does he always do that? Do what? Dismiss your achievements, and immediately pivot to praising Rachel. Every single thing you accomplish gets minimized and redirected. I'd lived with the pattern so long I barely noticed anymore, but hearing Alex name it made something shift inside me. It's just how he is. Rachel's always been the successful one. Bullshit, Mia. You run a thriving business, create beautiful art, and work harder than anyone I know. Your success doesn't diminish Rachel's, and hers doesn't diminish yours. There's room for both of you to be accomplished. No one had ever said that to me before. Our relationship deepened through shared music. Alex played guitar and had been working on compositions that blended traditional Mexican folk melodies with contemporary arrangements. He'd perform rough drafts after dinner while I sketched in my notebook, both of us creating in comfortable silence. 6 months into dating, Alex arranged a small concert in the Roosevelt High Auditorium, featuring his advanced students. The program showcased diverse musical style, from classical piano to mariachi guitar to contemporary vocal arrangements. As the evening concluded, Alex took the stage with his guitar. I want to dedicate this final piece to someone who's taught me that creativity comes in many forms, and that supporting the people you love means celebrating their individual talents, he said, finding my face in the small audience. Mia, this is for you. He played a gentle acoustic arrangement he'd written, incorporating melodies from both our cultural backgrounds. When he finished, he set down his guitar and pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. The proposal was perfect in its simplicity. No elaborate staging or public spectacle, just Alex on one knee in front of 40 high school students and their families, asking if I'd build a life with him based on mutual respect and shared dreams. I said yes through tears, and the auditorium erupted in teenage cheers and applause. My parents' reactions to our engagement revealed everything about their true feelings. Mom cried happy tears, immediately wanting to hear every detail about the proposal and Alex's beautiful song. She hugged me tightly, whispering about how proud she was and how perfect Alex seemed for me. Dad shook Alex's hand with forced politeness and offered congratulations that sounded more like condolences. I hope you know what you're getting into, he said, attempting a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. Marriage is expensive these days, especially on a teacher's salary. The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Alex's smile remained steady, but I saw his shoulders straighten slightly. I'm fortunate to be marrying someone with such a successful business. We'll do just fine together. That evening after Alex left, I was cleaning up the kitchen when I heard Dad talking to Mom in the living room. I wasn't intentionally eavesdropping, but their voices carried. I just hope she's thought this through, Dad was saying. Teachers don't make much money, and her art business isn't exactly stable income. Rachel and Michael have real financial security. Dan, she's happy. Alex is a wonderful young man from a lovely family. I'm sure he's nice enough. But nice doesn't pay mortgages or build retirement funds. I worry she's settling. I stood frozen at the kitchen sink dish towel in my hands, absorbing the familiar sting of Dad's disapproval. But this time something was different. Instead of the usual shame and self-doubt, I felt a spark of anger. Alex wasn't settling for me. I wasn't settling for Alex. We were choosing each other as equals, building something beautiful together. A few days later, while visiting Mom to discuss preliminary wedding plans, I made a disturbing discovery. Dad was in his home office with the door closed, but I needed to borrow scissors from his desk drawer. The room was cluttered with school paperwork, but what caught my attention were several documents scattered across his workspace. Bank forms, loan applications, and what appeared to be signature practice sheets with Mom's name, written repeatedly in Dad's handwriting. Some looked like attempts to match Mom's signature exactly. I'd seen enough legal documents through my business to recognize signature forgery when I saw it. My stomach dropped. Why would Dad be practicing Mom's signature? What documents required? Her authorization that she apparently wasn't providing willingly quickly grabbed the scissors and left his office. But the image of those papers haunted me for days. Something was wrong in my parents' marriage. Something involving money and deception. The perfect Thompson family facade was hiding cracks I'd never noticed before. But I had a wedding to plan, and I was determined not to let Dad's mysterious behavior or constant negativity overshadow the happiest time of my life. Alex and I were building something real, something honest, and something entirely our own. Alex and I spent countless evenings that winter planning our dream wedding. We'd spread venue brochures across my dining room table while sipping coffee and sketching ideas on napkins. After visiting 12 different locations throughout Riverside County, we fell in love with Sunset Ridge Vineyard in Temecula, nestled between rolling hills dotted with oak trees and endless rows of grapevines. The venue could accommodate 85 guests comfortably, with an outdoor ceremony space overlooking the valley and a rustic reception barn decorated with string lights and exposed wooden beams. It felt intimate without being cramped, elegant without being pretentious, perfect for the kind of celebration we envisioned. I'd been saving every spare dollar for 3 years, setting aside money from each design project in a dedicated wedding account. $35,000 would cover the venue catering, flowers photography, and all the details I'd been dreaming about since college. It represented sacrifice and discipline, skipping vacations and dinners out to make this day possible. Jessica and I met weekly to coordinate vendors and timeline details. Her expertise in event management complemented my design vision perfectly. We selected a photographer whose style captured candid emotion rather than posed perfection, a caterer who specialized in farm-to-table cuisine using local ingredients, and a florist who created arrangements with wildflowers and greenery that matched the vineyard's natural beauty. Every decision reflected our values rather than traditional expectations. The invitations featured hand-lettered calligraphy on recycled paper, embedded with wildflower seeds. Guests could plant them after the wedding, creating lasting memories that would bloom each spring. The menu included both Mexican and American dishes, honoring both our families' traditions. But sharing these plans with my parents proved more challenging than I'd anticipated. Mom seemed genuinely excited about the details, asking thoughtful questions about the ceremony timeline and reception layout. She offered to help with addressing invitations and coordinating transportation for out-of-town relatives. Her enthusiasm felt authentic and supportive. Dad's reaction was entirely different. He scrutinized every expense with the critical eye of a school administrator reviewing budget proposals. When I mentioned the venue cost, his eyebrows shot up. $10,000 just for the location. That seems excessive. For a single day. Rachel and Michael's wedding cost more, but they had 200 guests and Michael's banking salary to justify the expense. I tried explaining that the venue price included tables, chairs, linens, and coordination services, but Dad had already moved on to criticizing our catering choices. Why not just do a simple reception at the community center? Your cousin Jenny had a lovely wedding there last year, and it cost a fraction of what you're planning. Alex remained diplomatically quiet during these conversations, but I could see his jaw tighten whenever Dad made comparisons to Rachel's wedding or questioned our financial decisions. The contrast between my parents' responses and his family's unconditional excitement became increasingly stark. The Martinez family embraced every aspect of our wedding planning with infectious enthusiasm. Linda offered to make traditional Mexican wedding cookies for the dessert table. Carlos volunteered to build custom wooden signs for the ceremony and reception. Alex's sister Maria, a talented seamstress, insisted on creating a mantilla for me to wear during the ceremony, using lace that had belonged to their grandmother. The different approaches to wedding support crystallized during a family dinner at my parents' house in February. Alex and I had brought photo albums from venue visits to share our vision with everyone. Mom pored over pictures of the vineyard, asking about seasonal flowers and weather contingencies. Dad flipped through the albums with visible skepticism. This all looks very elaborate, Mia. Are you sure you've thought through the practical implications? Outdoor weddings have so many variables. Weather, parking, accessibility for elderly guests. Before I could respond, he continued. Rachel and Michael chose the grand ballroom at the Riverside Convention Center. Climate-controlled professional lighting, proven track record. Much more sensible for a significant investment. Alex finally spoke up. "We've visited the venue multiple times and discussed contingency plans with their coordinator. They've hosted hundreds of weddings successfully. We're confident in our choice." Dad turned to Alex with a condescending smile. "I appreciate your optimism, but planning a wedding requires more than just romantic idealism. There's financial reality to consider. Teacher salaries don't exactly provide unlimited budgets for dream weddings." The silence that followed felt suffocating. Mom looked uncomfortable, clearly wanting to intervene but unsure how. I felt my cheeks burning with embarrassment and anger. "We've budgeted carefully and saved for years," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "This isn't frivolous spending. It's an investment in celebrating our commitment with the people we love." Dad's response cut deep. "I just hope you're not setting unrealistic expectations. Marriage requires practical decisions, not fairy tale fantasies. Maybe you should consider a simpler ceremony and put the money toward a house down payment instead." Alex's hand found mine under the table, squeezing gently. His calm presence anchored me when I wanted to explode with frustration. The conversation moved on to other topics, but the damage was done. Dad had successfully planted seeds of doubt about our choices while positioning himself as the voice of mature wisdom. It was a pattern I recognized from childhood, the subtle undermining disguised as paternal concern. A week later, Jessica called with disturbing news. She'd been finalizing vendor contracts when she discovered something troubling. "Mia, I need to tell you something about your father. 3 of our vendors mentioned he contacted them asking for revised quotes, higher quotes. He told them he wanted to teach his daughter about realistic wedding costs." My stomach dropped. "What kind of revised quotes?" The photographer said your dad requested a quote that was double their original estimate. The florist got a similar call. They were confused because they had already agreed on pricing with us directly. I felt sick. Dad wasn't just criticizing our wedding plans. He was actively sabotaging them. Behind our backs, he was trying to manipulate vendors into charging us more money to prove some twisted point about financial responsibility. "Did any of them actually change their quotes?" I asked, dreading the answer. "No, thankfully. They called me first because it seemed strange. But Mia, this is really concerning behavior. Why would your father try to sabotage your wedding planning?" Couldn't answer Jessica's question because I didn't understand it myself. What kind of father actively undermines his daughter's wedding preparations? Was this about money control or something deeper? That evening, I confronted Mom about Dad's vendor calls. She seemed genuinely shocked and denied any knowledge of his actions. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Your father is just concerned about your financial future. He wants what's best for you. What's best for me is planning my wedding without interference and sabotage. This isn't concern, Mom, this is manipulation." She didn't have an answer and her silence spoke volumes. Mom knew Dad's behavior was wrong, but she wouldn't challenge him directly. She'd chosen her loyalty and it wasn't with me. I left my parents' house that night feeling more alone than I had since childhood. The little girl who'd always sought Dad's approval was finally seeing him clearly. He didn't want what was best for me. He wanted me to fail, to prove his point about my poor judgment and unrealistic expectations. But I wasn't that insecure little girl anymore. I was a successful businesswoman planning a wedding with a man who loved and respected me. Dad could undermine and sabotage all he wanted. Alex and I were building something real, something honest, and something entirely our own. The wedding planning continued, but now I knew we were doing it without my father's support. In fact, we were doing it despite his active opposition. That realization hurt more than I expected, but it also clarified everything. Some battles are worth fighting, and this was one of them. 3 weeks before our wedding, I started noticing things I'd been too distracted to see before, small details that didn't quite add up. Dad's increasing anxiety about money, despite his steady principal's salary. Mom's frequent mentions of late payment notices and overdue bills. The way Dad would abruptly end phone conversations when I walked into the room. It started with Jessica's revelation about the vendor manipulation, but my growing suspicion led me to pay closer attention to my parents' behavior. During family dinners, I found myself studying their interactions instead of just enduring. Dad's criticism. Mom would mention needing to pay the electric bill, and Dad would snap at her about timing. She'd suggest they needed to call the plumber about the kitchen faucet, and he'd insist they could fix it themselves. These weren't normal budget discussions between married couples. They had an edge of desperation that made me uncomfortable. My business was thriving that spring. I'd landed a $30,000 contract to design complete branding materials for a new medical practice opening in downtown Riverside. The project included logo design, website development, print materials, and signage. It represented everything I'd worked toward building a reputation for high-end professional design services. When I shared this news with my parents, expecting at least acknowledgement of my professional growth, Dad's reaction shocked me. $30,000 for design work, that seems inflated. Are you sure this client understands what they're actually getting? For that price, instead of pride or congratulations. He questioned my integrity and business practices, as if my success must somehow be fraudulent because it didn't align with his expectations. How did you even find this client? He continued, his tone implying something suspicious about my networking abilities. They were referred by another satisfied client, I replied, trying to keep my voice level. Word-of-mouth marketing is how most creative businesses grow. Alex, who'd been quietly eating dinner beside me, finally spoke up. Mia's work is incredible, Mr. Thompson. I've seen the difference her designs make for local businesses. She's built her reputation through talent and professionalism. Dad turned his critical gaze to Alex. I'm sure you're supportive of Mia's endeavors, but understanding business requires more than just artistic appreciation. There's market reality to consider. The conversation reminded me of those signature practice sheets I'd discovered in Dad's office months earlier. I'd pushed the memory aside during wedding planning, but now it resurfaced with new significance. Why would Dad need to forge Mom's signature unless he was hiding financial decisions from her? That weekend, Jessica and I were reviewing final vendor payments when she casually mentioned something that made my blood run cold. By the way, I heard through the grapevine that your dad's been spotted at Morongo Casino pretty frequently. Maria Gonzalez from the flower shop mentioned seeing him there when she went with her husband last month. Morongo Casino was about 45 minutes east of Riverside, nestled in the desert foothills. It wasn't a place someone would accidentally end up, and it certainly wasn't Dad's typical weekend activity. Are you sure it was him? I asked, hoping Jessica was mistaken. Maria said she recognized him from parent conferences at Roosevelt. Hi. She was surprised because he seemed so focused on the poker tables. She thought it was strange for a school principal to be gambling on a Saturday afternoon. Pieces of a disturbing puzzle started clicking together. Dad's financial anxiety, the forged signature practice sheets, his aggressive criticism of our wedding expenses, and now gambling. A terrible picture was emerging, one that explained his increasingly erratic behavior. I decided to confront Mom about the casino rumors, hoping she could provide innocent explanations. I found her in the kitchen Monday evening, preparing dinner while Dad worked late at school. Mom, I need to ask you something. And I need you to be honest with me. Is everything okay financially with you and Dad? She paused her vegetable chopping, but didn't look up. What do you mean we're managing fine? Jessica heard Dad's been seen at Morongo Casino. Is that true? Mom's knife slipped, nearly cutting her finger. She set it down carefully and finally met my eyes. I don't know what you're talking about. Your father doesn't gamble. But her voice shook slightly and she couldn't maintain eye contact. She knew something, even if she didn't want to admit it. Mom, I found signature practice sheets in Dad's office months ago. Sheets with your name written over and over in his handwriting. What would he need to forge your signature for? The color drained from her face. I don't know anything about that. You must have misunderstood what you saw. Her denials felt desperate rather than convincing. She was protecting Dad, or maybe protecting herself from acknowledging something she didn't want to face. That evening, I called Rachel in San Diego. Despite our complicated relationship, she was still my sister, and her legal background might help me understand what I was observing. Rachel, I need to ask you something confidential. If someone was forging their spouse's signature, what would that usually indicate, Mia? That's a very specific question. Is everything okay? I'm not sure. I'm seeing some concerning things with Mom and Dad, and I don't know how to interpret them. Rachel's voice became serious. Signature forgery in a marriage usually involves financial documents. Loan applications, credit cards, maybe accessing accounts or assets without consent. It's actually a form of financial abuse and fraud. What if there were also rumors about gambling? Oh no. Mia, gambling addiction combined with financial deception is a dangerous combination. People can lose everything, including money that isn't legally theirs to gamble with. My worst fears were being confirmed by someone who understood legal implications. Dad wasn't just hiding his gambling from Mom. He was potentially stealing from her to fund it. The next day, I made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. I drove to Morongo Casino during my lunch break, hoping to find evidence that would either confirm or dispel my suspicions. The casino parking lot was packed with cars from across the inland empire. Inside, the atmosphere was a mixture of excitement and desperation. Flashing lights, ringing slot machines, and the constant shuffle of cards and chips created a sensory overload. I didn't have to search long. At a poker table near the back of the gaming floor, I saw him. Dad sat hunched over his cards, a stack of chips in front of him, completely absorbed in the game. He looked different than I'd ever seen him before. Intense, focused, almost predatory in his concentration. I watched from across the room as he played hand after hand, sometimes winning small amounts, mostly losing. His body language spoke of familiarity with the environment. This wasn't occasional recreation. This was routine. During a break between hands, I approached his table. Dad looked up and saw me, his face cycling through surprise, embarrassment, and finally anger. "Mia, what are you doing here? I could ask you the same question. How long has this been going on?" He gathered his remaining chips and stood up abruptly. "We need to talk privately." Outside in the parking lot, away from the casino's noise and distraction, Dad tried to regain control of the narrative. "This isn't what it looks like. I come here occasionally to relax. It's harmless entertainment. How often is it? And how much money are you spending on harmless entertainment?" His defensive posture crumbled slightly. "That's between your mother and me. You have no right to question how I spend my own money. What about Mom's money? What about those signature sheets I found? In your office," Dad's face went white with rage. "You went through my private papers. You have no right to snoop around my personal business." His reaction confirmed everything I'd feared. The gambling, the financial deception, the forged signatures. It was all true. "Dad, this has to stop. You're going to destroy our family financially. Mom doesn't even know, does she?" Instead of answering directly, he launched into an attack that revealed the depth of his desperation and guilt. "You want to talk about destroying the family financially? Look at yourself, Mia. $35,000 for one day. A wedding that's putting enormous pressure on everyone. At least my recreational activities don't burden other people." The accusation was so twisted it took my breath away. Dad was blaming me for his gambling addiction. My wedding planning had somehow forced him to forge Mom's signature and lose thousands of dollars at poker tables. My recreational activities, as he called them, were destroying our family's financial stability. But somehow, it was my fault for planning a wedding with money I'd saved myself. Standing in that casino parking lot, watching my father blame me for his self-destructive choices, I realized our family's foundation had been crumbling for years. The constant criticism, the undermining of my achievements, the vendor manipulation. It was all connected to his gambling addiction and the guilt that came with it. Dad needed a scapegoat for his poor decisions, and I'd been playing that role my entire life. The disappointing daughter whose choices justified his disappointment in himself, but not anymore. I was done being his excuse for failure, and I was done protecting him from the consequences of his actions. The wedding was 3 weeks away, and now I knew we were celebrating more than just Alex and my commitment to each other. We were breaking free from a legacy of deception and building something honest together. Dad could gamble away his integrity, but he wasn't going to gamble away my future. 2 weeks before the wedding, I couldn't pretend anymore that Dad's gambling was just harmless recreation. The evidence was mounting daily, and my investigation with Alex and Jessica was revealing the true scope of the damage. Jessica had become my secret ally in documenting Dad's erratic behavior. She started keeping detailed notes of every strange interaction, every contradictory statement he made about money, every time his story changed about family finances. "Your dad called the caterer yesterday asking about payment terms," Jessica told me during one of our planning sessions. "He wanted to know if they'd accept partial payments over several months instead of the lump sum we agreed on. When I told him we'd already handled the payment, he got defensive and hung up. This was new information. Dad was now directly interfering with vendor relationships, trying to renegotiate contracts we'd already finalized. The desperation in his actions suggested his situation was worse than I'd initially thought. Alex and I spent that Saturday afternoon at the Riverside Public Library, using their computers to research gambling addiction and its financial consequences. What we discovered was terrifying. The average gambling addict loses $45,000 before seeking help. Many steal from employers' family members or access joint accounts without consent. We found articles about school administrators who'd embezzled funds to cover gambling debts, teachers, principals, and superintendents who'd destroyed their careers and faced criminal charges for stealing from student activity accounts. fundraising money or petty cash funds. My stomach turned as I read story after story that sounded exactly like what I suspected about Dad. The progression was always similar. Small amounts at first, then larger sums, then desperate borrowing and stealing to chase losses. Many were caught only when mandatory audits revealed discrepancies. "I need to call Rachel," I told Alex as we drove home from the library. "If Dad's embezzling from Roosevelt High, this isn't just about family finances anymore. This is criminal behavior." Rachel answered on the second ring, sounding harried but alert. She was in her downtown San Diego office, working weekend hours on a complex corporate merger. "Mia, what's wrong? You sound upset." I explained everything we'd discovered. The casino visits, the forged signatures, Dad's interference with wedding vendors, and our research about gambling addiction and embezzlement. Rachel was quiet for a long moment before responding. "This is serious, Mia. If he's taking money from the school district, he could face felony charges. Embezzlement from a public institution carries mandatory prison time in California. How much money are we talking about before it becomes a felony? Anything over $400 is a felony if it's from a public institution. But Mia, if he's been doing this for months or years, we could be looking at tens of thousands of dollars." I felt sick. Dad's entire career, his reputation. Our family's standing in the community. Everything could be destroyed. And if he was stealing from school funds, he was stealing from children's programs and activities. "What should I do?" I asked Rachel, hoping she'd have legal advice that could somehow fix this situation. "You need to document everything. Bank statements, any evidence of the forged signatures, records of his gambling activities. If this comes out, and it probably will during a school audit, you'll want evidence that the family tried to address the problem." Rachel's practical approach helped me focus on actionable steps, instead of drowning in panic, but her next words chilled me. "Mia, you need to prepare for the possibility that Dad won't be walking you down the aisle. If the school district presses charges before the wedding, he could be in custody. That possibility hadn't occurred to me. Our wedding was 2 weeks away, and Dad might be arrested before then." The thought was surreal and heartbreaking, despite everything he'd put us through. Monday morning brought the confrontation I'd been dreading. Dad appeared at my apartment without warning, looking haggard and desperate. He'd clearly been awake all night, his clothes wrinkled and his eyes bloodshot. "We need to talk about the wedding expenses," he said without preamble. "I need you to contribute some of your wedding fund toward a family emergency." My heart raced. This was it. The moment I'd been expecting since discovering his gambling addiction. "What kind of emergency?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Dad's explanation was vague and contradictory. "A temporary cash flow problem, unexpected medical bills, investment opportunities that required immediate action." None of it made sense, and all of it sounded like desperate lies. "How much money do you need?" I asked directly. $10,000. "Just temporarily. I'll pay it back after the wedding when some investments mature." $10,000 was nearly a third of our entire wedding budget. It would mean canceling vendors, reducing our guest count, or moving to a cheaper venue at the last minute. "Dad, I can't give you wedding money 2 weeks before the wedding. Every vendor has been paid. The contracts are signed." His desperation transformed into anger. "You're being selfish, Mia. This family is facing a crisis, and all you care about is your party." Rachel would never hesitate to help a family in need. The comparison to Rachel stung as it was intended to, but I was done being manipulated by his favorite weapon. "What's the real emergency?" "Dad, how much have you lost?" "Gambling." His face went white, then flushed red with rage. "How dare you accuse me of gambling away family money? I work hard every day to provide for this family, and this is how you show gratitude." I pulled out my phone and showed him photos I'd taken at Morongo Casino. Pictures of him at the poker tables that I'd captured from across the gaming floor. The evidence was undeniable, and Dad's entire demeanor shifted. The angry bluster collapsed into pleading desperation. "Mia, you don't understand the pressure I'm under. The school district is conducting surprise audits. There are some accounting discrepancies that need to be resolved before they become problems." Accounting discrepancies. The euphemism for embezzlement confirmed my worst fears. "How much did you take from the school?" "Dad," his silence was answer enough. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. $28,000. From student activity funds and petty cash over the past 2 years. I kept thinking I could win it back, but the losses kept mounting. $28,000 stolen from children's programs. Money meant for field trips, art supplies, sports equipment, and educational activities. Dad had gambled away resources that belonged to the students he was supposed to protect and serve. The full scope of his betrayal hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about family finances or wedding planning anymore. Dad had violated the public trust stolen from children and jeopardized his entire career for poker chips and slot machine pulls. "If you don't help me replace this money immediately," he continued, "everything will come out. The investigation, the charges, the media attention, our family name will be destroyed right before your wedding." There it was, the threat wrapped in desperation. Dad wanted me to use my wedding fund to cover his embezzlement, to become complicit in covering up his crimes. And he was threatening that if I didn't comply, he'd ensure our wedding was overshadowed by scandal. The manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty. He was willing to destroy my wedding day to avoid facing consequences for his own actions. I looked at this man I'd called Dad for 26 years, this person who'd criticized my choices and undermined my confidence, while secretly stealing from children. The principal who preached about responsibility and character while forging his wife's signature and gambling away public funds. "I won't give you money to cover up crimes, Dad. If you've stolen from the school district, you need to face the consequences and make restitution properly." His response was swift and vicious. "Then you can explain to your wedding guests why your father is sitting in jail instead of walking you down the aisle. You can explain to the community why the Thompson family name is associated with scandal and disgrace." Standing in my living room, watching my father threaten to sabotage my wedding unless I helped him cover up embezzlement, I realized our relationship had been built on lies and manipulation. For years, this was just the most extreme example of patterns that had shaped my entire childhood. Dad left my apartment that day with empty hands and threats hanging in the air. I knew he meant every word. If I didn't help him, he'd ensure our wedding became collateral damage in his self-destruction. But I also knew I couldn't become an accessory to his crimes, no matter what he threatened to do to my special day. 1 week before our wedding, my worst fears materialized in the form of a bank alert on my phone. Unauthorized withdrawal from wedding account, $8,000. Accessing the account required 2 signatures, mine and the co-signer I'd added for security purposes. My hands shook as I called the bank, already knowing what they'd tell me but hoping I was wrong. The withdrawal was processed yesterday afternoon with proper authorization from both account holders. The customer service representative explained cheerfully, oblivious to the devastation her words caused. Who was the second signature, I asked, though I already knew. Sarah Thompson, listed as co-signer on the account. My own mother had helped Dad steal my wedding money. The betrayal cut deeper than anything he'd done because I'd trusted her, confided in her, and believed she would protect me from his destructive behavior. I drove directly to my parents' house, the bank paperwork clutched in my trembling hand. I found them in the kitchen, Mom washing dishes while Dad read his newspaper as if nothing had happened. $8,000, I said, setting the withdrawal slip on the counter. "You stole $8,000 from my wedding account." Mom's face crumpled with guilt and shame. Dad didn't even look up from his paper. "It wasn't stealing," he said calmly. "It was an emergency loan from my family. You'll get the money back." The casual tone of his response ignited fury I'd never felt before. An emergency loan requires asking permission. This was theft. "You forged Mom's signature and stole my wedding money." Now Dad looked up, his expression cold and calculating. "I didn't forge anything. Your mother signed the withdrawal slip voluntarily. Didn't you, Sarah?" Mom stood frozen at the sink, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't meet my eyes, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything except cry silently while her husband forced her to choose between her daughter and her marriage. "How could you do this to me?" I asked her directly. "You know how hard I worked to save this money. You know what this wedding means to me." Her response came out in broken whispers. "He said it was temporary. He promised to pay it back before the wedding. He said the family would lose everything if he didn't handle this. Emergency immediately." Dad had manipulated her with the same desperation and threats he'd used on me. But unlike me, Mom had believed his lies and enabled his theft. "What emergency was worth stealing from your daughter's wedding?" "Fund," I demanded, turning back to Dad. His answer revealed the true depths of his self-destruction. "The school audit found additional discrepancies. The amount they're questioning has increased. I needed to make partial restitution immediately to avoid criminal charges. So you decided to steal more money to cover up the money you'd already stolen. Do you understand how insane that sounds?" Dad's composure finally cracked. "You have no idea the pressure I'm facing. My entire career is at stake. Our family's reputation, our financial security. Everything depends on resolving this situation quietly. I looked around the kitchen where I'd grown up, seeing it clearly for perhaps the first time. The expensive appliances Mom had insisted on buying 5 years ago. The granite countertops Dad had proudly shown off to neighbors. The lifestyle they'd maintained on a principal's salary supplemented by stolen funds. How long has this been going on, I asked. How long have you been stealing to maintain this house? This lifestyle neither of them answered, which was answer enough. The theft hadn't started recently. It had been happening for years, funding a standard of living they couldn't actually afford. Supporting Dad's gambling habit while presenting a facade of middle-class stability. I called Rachel from the parking lot outside my parents' house. She answered immediately, sensing the urgency in my voice. He stole $8,000 from my wedding account, I told her without a preamble. Used Mom as an accomplice to access the funds. Rachel was quiet for a moment, processing the information. Mia, I'm flying up tomorrow. This has gone beyond family dysfunction into criminal behavior. You need legal protection and they need professional intervention. Can we get the money back? Not immediately, but I can file paperwork to freeze their access to any joint accounts and begin recovery proceedings. The more important issue is protecting you from further theft. Rachel's arrival the next day marked a turning point in our family. Crisis. She walked into our parents' house with a briefcase in hand and the authoritative presence that had made her successful in corporate law. Mom and Dad, we need to discuss the legal implications of stealing from Mia's wedding account, she announced, setting legal documents on the dining room table. What you've done constitutes financial abuse and theft. These are the potential criminal charges and civil penalties you're facing. Dad tried to maintain his victim narrative. Rachel, you don't understand the complex situation we're dealing with. Sometimes family members need to make sacrifices for the greater good. Rachel's response was swift and professional. The greater good doesn't include embezzlement from public institutions or theft from family members. Mia has asked me to represent her interests, and I'm prepared to file criminal charges against both of you unless full restitution is made immediately. Mom broke down completely at the mention of criminal charges. We don't have the money to pay her back right now. Everything is tied up in trying to resolve the school situation. Then you'll need to liquidate assets, take out loans, or find other sources of funds, Rachel replied matter-of-factly. This theft occurred 1 week before Mia's wedding. The timing suggests intentional sabotage of her special day. Dad's carefully constructed facade finally shattered completely. Fine. You want to know the truth. I hoped the financial pressure would force her to cancel this ridiculous wedding and have a simple courthouse ceremony instead. $35,000 for 1 day is obscene when the family is facing bankruptcy. The admission hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Dad hadn't just stolen my wedding money out of desperation. He'd stolen it strategically, hoping to force me to cancel my wedding entirely. The man who was supposed to walk me down the aisle in 6 days had actively sabotaged the most important day of my life to avoid facing consequences for his own criminal behavior. Rachel immediately began documenting Dad's confession, taking notes that would become part of the legal record. Mom sobbed at the kitchen table, finally understanding the full scope of her husband's manipulation and her own complicity. I felt strangely calm watching my family implode. The uncertainty was over. The manipulation was exposed. Dad's true character was finally visible to everyone, including Mom. Alex arrived within an hour of Rachel's call, bringing his parents, Carlos and Linda. The Martinez family took one look at the situation and immediately offered solutions. We can cover the missing money, Carlos said simply. Family helps family, no questions asked. Linda hugged me tightly, whispering reassurance that everything would work out, that love would prevail over dysfunction. The contrast between our families was stark and revealing. While my parents had spent years building a facade funded by stolen money and maintained through manipulation, Alex's family offered genuine support without conditions or expectations. Jessica arrived with vendor contact information and emergency payment options. The wedding could proceed as planned if we acted quickly to address the financial shortfall. But standing in that kitchen, surrounded by people who truly loved and supported me, I realized the most important decision wasn't about money or vendors or wedding logistics. The most important decision was about who would walk me down the aisle. And it wasn't going to be the man who'd stolen my wedding funds to cover up his embezzlement from children's programs. Dad could keep his stolen money and his gambling addiction and his criminal behavior. But he couldn't keep sabotaging my future, and he definitely wouldn't be part of my wedding day. Some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. And some people, once they reveal their true character, can never be trusted again. The wedding was 6 days away, and it was going to be beautiful despite everything Dad had done to destroy it. The week of our wedding transformed into a psychological battlefield that I never could have imagined. Dad had shifted from desperate pleading to calculated warfare, determined to control the narrative even as his world collapsed around him. He started calling relatives and family friends, spinning a version of events that painted him as the responsible father trying to prevent his daughter from making catastrophic financial mistakes. According to his story, I was being reckless with money while the family faced serious economic challenges, and he was simply trying to teach me fiscal responsibility. My phone rang constantly with concerned relatives asking if everything was okay, if we needed help managing wedding expenses, if perhaps we should consider a smaller celebration given the family's financial difficulties. Each call was another reminder of Dad's manipulation reaching into our extended network. Aunt Susan called from San Francisco, her voice heavy with worry. "Mia, honey, your father mentioned you might be in over your head with wedding costs. Uncle Bob and I are concerned about you starting your marriage with financial stress." I had to explain to my father's sister that he'd embezzled money from his school district stolen from my wedding account and was now spreading lies to justify his behavior. The conversation left both of us exhausted and heartbroken, but Dad's campaign went beyond family members. Jessica discovered he'd contacted several of our wedding vendors, again, this time claiming there might be payment issues due to family emergencies. He was trying to create the financial crisis he'd been lying about, hoping vendors would pressure us into canceling or drastically reducing services. Mom was caught in an impossible position. Rachel's legal intervention had forced her to confront the reality of Dad's actions. But 30 years of marriage don't dissolve overnight. I found her crying in her garden Tuesday evening, pulling weeds with angry, desperate motions. "I don't know what's real anymore," she confided when I sat beside her on the garden bench. "He swears he can fix everything, that this is all temporary, that the gambling was just bad luck that can be turned around. Mom, he stole from children's programs, he forged your signature, he took my wedding money. These aren't temporary problems or bad luck. This is criminal behavior." She looked older than I'd ever seen her, worn down by the weight of enabling his lies for so long. I know all of that, but he's my husband, Mia. How do I choose between supporting him and supporting my daughter? You don't have to choose between us. You need to choose between right and wrong. Wednesday brought escalation that crossed every line of decency I thought Dad still possessed. He called Alex directly, attempting to manipulate him the way he'd manipulated Mom for years. Alex recounted the conversation to me that evening, his usually calm demeanor shaken by the encounter. "He told me that marrying you would be the biggest financial mistake of my life," Alex said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "He said you've never learned to manage money responsibly, that your business success is largely luck, and that I'd be inheriting your family's financial problems along with you." The cruelty of Dad's words took my breath away. He was actively trying to sabotage my relationship, to plant seeds of doubt in my fiancé's mind days before our wedding. "What did you tell him?" I asked, dreading Alex's response. "I told him that I've never met anyone more responsible or hardworking than you, that your business success comes from talent and dedication, not luck, and that the only financial problem I'm concerned about is his gambling addiction and theft." Alex's unwavering support anchored me when I felt like drowning in Dad's toxicity, but the damage was spreading beyond our immediate family. Thursday evening brought the confrontation I'd been dreading. Dad demanded a family meeting, claiming he had important information to share before the wedding. Rachel advised against it, but Mom pleaded for one last attempt at family unity. We gathered in the living room where I'd grown up, the same space where Dad had dismissed my achievements and praised Rachel for years. Now the power dynamic had shifted completely. "I want everyone to understand my position," Dad began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he used with students and teachers. "This family is facing bankruptcy because of poor financial decisions and unrealistic expectations. I've made mistakes trying to solve problems that others created. Even now, facing criminal charges and exposed as a thief, he was blaming others for his actions." Rachel responded with legal precision. "Dan, you've embezzled $28,000 from public funds over 2 years. You've stolen $8,000 from Mia's wedding account. You've forged Sarah's signature on financial documents. These are felony charges with mandatory prison sentences." Dad's response revealed the depth of his delusion and desperation. If this family had been more supportive, if certain people had been more understanding about temporary financial arrangements, none of this would have been necessary. He was blaming me for his embezzlement. My wedding planning had somehow forced him to steal from children's programs. My refusal to enable his gambling addiction had driven him to forge signatures and manipulate vendors. The twisted logic was breathtaking in its narcissism. Dad had constructed a reality where everyone else was responsible for his criminal behavior. Mom finally found her voice. Dan, stop. Just stop blaming everyone else. You gambled away our money. You stole from your students. You lied to me for years. Mia didn't cause any of this. Her words seemed to break something fundamental in Dad's facade. The authoritative principal mask slipped away, revealing the desperate, angry man underneath. Fine, he snarled, his voice rising. You want to know the truth? I'm embarrassed by this wedding. I'm ashamed to walk my daughter down the aisle for a celebration that represents everything wrong with this family's priorities. Maybe our wedding guests should know the real story about why we're facing financial ruin. The threat was explicit and chilling. Dad was planning to sabotage our wedding ceremony itself, to use his role in the processional to expose what he called family secrets and justify his behavior to our assembled guests. Jessica had been documenting everything from her position near the kitchen doorway, and she immediately began recording Dad's threats on her phone. His words would become crucial evidence in the legal proceedings that would follow. You will not ruin my wedding day, I told him, my voice steady despite the fury burning in my chest. You've stolen from me, lied about me, and tried to sabotage my relationship, but you will not destroy my wedding. Dad's smile was cold and calculating. We'll see about that. The father of the bride has certain traditional rights and responsibilities. Maybe it's time I exercise them honestly. I left my parents' house that evening knowing that Dad intended to turn our wedding ceremony into a public platform for his justifications and blame-shifting. He would use the captive audience of our guests to humiliate me one final time while positioning himself as the victim of family circumstances, but I also left with absolute clarity about what needed to happen. Dad would not be walking me down the aisle. He would not be participating in our ceremony. He would not be invited to witness the most important day of my life. The little girl who had spent 26 years seeking his approval was finally done. The woman who had built a successful business and found genuine love deserved better than a father who would steal her wedding money and threaten to sabotage her marriage ceremony. Carlos Martinez would walk me down the aisle. A man who had shown me more paternal love and support in 2 years than my biological father had provided in a lifetime. Some family bonds are chosen rather than inherited, and sometimes the family that matters most is the one that chooses to love you unconditionally. Saturday morning dawned clear and beautiful over Temecula wine country. The vineyard looked like something from a fairy tale, with morning mist rising from the valley floor and golden sunlight filtering through oak trees that had witnessed countless celebrations of love and commitment. I woke up in the bridal suite at Sunset Ridge Vineyard, surrounded by the women who had become my chosen family. Rachel sat by the window, already dressed and reviewing her maid of honor speech. Jessica bustled around with vendor checklists and timeline confirmations. Linda Martinez hummed traditional Mexican melodies while steaming my wedding dress. The contrast with what a normal wedding morning should have been was stark and painful. Mom should have been here, helping me into my dress and sharing mother-daughter moments we'd both dreamed about. Instead, she was at home dealing with the aftermath of Dad's self-destruction. She arrived at 9 o'clock looking exhausted but determined. Her eyes were red from crying, but she carried herself with a dignity I hadn't seen in years. I know I can't undo what happened this week, she said quietly, sitting beside me at the vanity mirror, but I want to be here for you today if you'll let me. Your father's choices don't have to define this moment. The conversation we'd needed to have for years finally happened in that sunlit bridal suite. Mom apologized for enabling Dad's behavior, for choosing loyalty to him over protection of me, for signing documents she didn't understand and facilitating theft she should have prevented. I should have left him years ago when I first suspected the gambling, she admitted. I should have protected you from his manipulation and criticism. I failed as your mother, and I'm sorry. Her apology couldn't erase decades of favoritism and neglect, but it was a beginning. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like Mom was seeing me clearly and choosing to support me, unconditionally. Linda helped me into my wedding dress, the same one we'd selected months ago when the biggest worry was whether the alterations would be completed on time. The ivory silk felt like armor against the chaos Dad had created. a symbol of hope and new beginnings despite the family dysfunction. Surrounding us, Jessica coordinated the vendor arrivals with military precision. The photographer captured getting-ready moments that managed to feel joyful despite the underlying tension. The florist delivered arrangements that perfectly matched our vision, of natural elegance enhanced by cultivated beauty. Alex's extended family began arriving mid-morning, filling the vineyard with laughter and music that provided a stark contrast to the Thompson family drama. His cousins brought guitars and started impromptu performances. His aunts and uncles set up traditional Mexican wedding decorations, alongside the rustic vineyard aesthetic we'd planned. The Martinez family's approach to celebration was infectious and healing. They focused on joy rather than problems, on love rather than conflicts, on bringing people together rather than tearing them apart. But the question of Dad's attendance loomed over every preparation. He hadn't been officially disinvited, despite his threats and behavior throughout the week. Mom had pleaded for family unity, suggesting that his presence might prevent him from following through on his sabotage threats. Rachel disagreed strongly. If he shows up planning to cause a scene, we need security prepared to remove him quietly. Jessica has contacts with event security professionals who can handle family disruptions discreetly. The decision was made for us when Pastor Williams arrived for our final consultation 2 hours before the ceremony. He'd been hearing rumors throughout the week about Thompson family problems and wanted to address potential issues before standing in front of 85 wedding guests. "Mia, I've known your family for 15 years, he said gently. Your father seems to be going through some kind of crisis. Several people have mentioned concerning conversations they've had with him this week. I want to make sure we're prepared if he attempts to disrupt the ceremony." I explained the situation in broad terms without revealing the criminal details. Dad was facing personal and professional difficulties that were affecting his judgment. He'd made threats about using the wedding ceremony to air family grievances publicly. Pastor Williams nodded thoughtfully. "I've seen this before with families under extreme stress. Sometimes people use weddings as platforms for addressing unrelated conflicts. We can modify the ceremony structure to minimize opportunities for disruption." His experience with family dysfunction was both comforting and heartbreaking. How many other weddings had been threatened by toxic family dynamics? How many other brides had needed security protocols to protect their special day from their own relatives an hour before? The ceremony cars began arriving for the day's first major test. Would Dad show up? Would he come alone or bring Mom? Would he attempt to participate normally or carry through on his threats? The answer came in the form of his truck pulling into the vineyard parking area just as vendors were completing final setup tasks. Dad climbed out looking disheveled and agitated, clearly operating on very little sleep and maximum stress. Mom emerged from the passenger side, her face set in grim determination. She'd obviously spent the morning trying to manage his behavior, probably with limited success based on his appearance and demeanor. Jessica immediately activated the discreet security protocols we'd discussed. 2 of Alex's cousins who worked in event security positioned themselves strategically around the ceremony site. Pastor Williams was alerted to Dad's arrival and potential for disruption. I watched through the bridal suite window as Dad surveyed the vineyard setup with visible criticism, even on my wedding day. In a location we'd chosen carefully and decorated lovingly, he found fault with our choices. He began approaching guests as they arrived, intercepting them before they could find their seats. I couldn't hear the conversations from my window, but the body language was unmistakable. Dad was sharing his version of family financial problems with our wedding guests. Uncle Robert and Aunt Susan looked uncomfortable as Dad gestured emphatically. Jessica's parents appeared confused by whatever story Dad was telling them. Even Alex's relatives who didn't know Dad well seemed taken aback by his intense demeanor and inappropriate timing. Rachel knocked on the bridal suite door, her voice tight with controlled anger. "He's working the crowd, telling anyone who'll listen about family financial stress and poor decision-making. He's positioning himself as the long-suffering father dealing with an irresponsible daughter." The manipulation continued even here, even now, even at my own wedding ceremony. Dad couldn't let this day be about love and celebration and new beginnings. He had to make it about his problems, his justifications, his version of reality. But something had shifted inside me during this week of warfare. Instead of feeling defeated by his behavior, I felt liberated by its absolute clarity. There was no ambiguity anymore about who Dad really was and what he valued. He'd chosen his gambling addiction over his family. He'd chosen theft over honesty. He'd chosen manipulation over genuine relationship. And now he was choosing to sabotage my wedding day over supporting my happiness. Those choices revealed everything I needed to know about him and nothing I needed to doubt about myself. Carlos appeared at the bridal suite door in his perfectly pressed suit, looking every inch the proud father of the bride. He'd volunteered to walk me down the aisle after Dad's threats became clear, and his presence radiated the kind of paternal love and support I'd always craved. "Mija," he said softly, "you look beautiful. Are you ready to marry my son and become part of our family?" Officially, the contrast between Carlos and Dad couldn't have been starker. One man was here to celebrate love and support new beginnings. The other was working the crowd to justify his self-destructive behavior. The choice was obvious, and for the first time all week, I felt completely at peace. I was ready to walk down the aisle toward Alex and our future together. And I was ready to leave the toxic dysfunction of my childhood family behind forever. The processional music began at exactly 4 o'clock. Floating across the vineyard on the warm afternoon breeze, Pastor Williams stood beneath the wooden arch that Alex's uncle had built specifically for our ceremony, decorated with white roses and eucalyptus branches that complemented the natural beauty of the surrounding grapevines. 85 guests rose from their white wooden chairs, turning to watch the wedding party make their way down the aisle that wound between the vine rows toward the ceremony site. The afternoon light was perfect, golden, and soft, casting everything in the warm glow I'd dreamed about during months of planning. Alex stood at the altar with Carlos as his best man, both wearing charcoal gray suits with burgundy ties that matched the vineyard's autumn colors. Alex's face lit up when the music started, and even from the back of the aisle, I could see the emotion in his eyes as he anticipated seeing me in my wedding dress for the first time. The bridesmaids began their procession first. Rachel walked with the poise and confidence that had always characterized her, but today her smile was genuine and supportive rather than competitive. Jessica followed, beaming with the satisfaction of a wedding planner whose months of careful coordination were finally coming together flawlessly. Alex's sister Maria came next, carrying a bouquet of burgundy dahlias and cream roses, her steps measured and graceful. She'd been so welcoming from the moment Alex and I started dating, treating me like the sister she'd always wanted rather than an outsider to their close-knit family. Then came the moment I'd been both anticipating and dreading. Carlos offered me his arm, looking distinguished and proud in his perfectly fitted suit. Behind us, Dad stood at the edge of the processional area, his presence like a storm cloud threatening to disrupt the perfect afternoon. We'd made the difficult decision that morning. Carlos would walk me down the aisle while Dad watched from among the guests. It was a compromise that honored my relationship with Alex's father, while acknowledging the reality of my biological father's behavior throughout our engagement. As Carlos and I began walking down the aisle, I focused on Alex's face rather than the guests seated on either side. His expression of pure love and joy anchored me, reminding me why we were here and what this day truly meant despite the family drama surrounding it. But halfway down the aisle, Dad's voice cut through the gentle murmur of wedding guests admiring my dress and the ceremony decorations. "At least Rachel's wedding looked professional," he said, loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear clearly. The comment was like a slap across the face in front of everyone we cared about. Guests turned to look at Dad with expressions ranging from confusion to embarrassment. Mom sat beside him, her face flushed with shame as she tried to quiet him with urgent whispers. Carlos's grip on my arm tightened slightly, a protective gesture that steadied me when I felt like stumbling. He leaned close and whispered, "Keep walking, Mija. Don't let him steal this moment." I forced myself to continue down the aisle, my smile wavering but determined. Alex's expression had shifted from joy to concern as he realized something was wrong. Pastor Williams looked uncomfortable but maintained his professional composure. We reached the altar despite Dad's disruption, and Carlos placed my hand in Alex's with the kind of paternal blessing that should have come from my own father. The ceremony began with Pastor Williams welcoming our families and friends, emphasizing the joining of 2 people and 2 families in love and mutual support. But as we approached the traditional moment where the father of the bride formally gives his daughter away, Dad rose from his seat. Instead of remaining with the other guests, he walked toward the altar with the purposeful stride of someone who believed he had important business to conduct. Pastor Williams paused the ceremony, clearly uncertain how to handle this disruption. The guests murmured in confusion as Dad positioned himself beside Carlos and me, inserting himself into a moment he'd forfeited through his behavior. "I think there's been some confusion about roles here," Dad announced, his voice carrying across the silent vineyard. "I'm Mia's father, and I should be the one participating in this ceremony." The presumption was breathtaking. After everything he'd done, the theft and manipulation and threats, he still believed he was entitled to play the role of proud father. "At my wedding." Alex stepped forward protectively. "Mr. Thompson, we discussed this yesterday. Carlos is walking Mia down the aisle at our request." Dad's response revealed the depth of his delusion and desperation. These young people don't understand the financial realities of marriage. They're starting their lives together with unrealistic expectations and poor planning. He was using our wedding ceremony as a platform to justify his behavior and criticize our choices in front of our assembled guests. The captive audience he'd threatened to address all week was finally his Pastor Williams attempted to redirect the ceremony. "Perhaps we should continue with the planned order of service." But Dad wasn't finished. He looked out at our guests, many of whom knew nothing about his gambling addiction or embezzlement, and continued his public justification. "I hope you all realize what you're witnessing here. A young woman who's never learned financial responsibility spending more money than her family can afford while we face serious economic challenges. Her sister Rachel would never put family through this kind of stress." The cruelty of comparing me to Rachel at my own wedding ceremony, in front of everyone we cared about, was stunning even by Dad's standards. He'd found the most public, most hurtful possible moment to deliver his favorite weapon. Alex's cousins began moving closer to the altar, ready to escort Dad away from the ceremony if necessary. Mom was crying openly now, covering her face with her hands. Rachel stood with the other bridesmaids, her lawyer's mind probably calculating the legal implications of Dad's public statements. The guests sat in uncomfortable silence, witnessing a family meltdown that had hijacked what should have been a celebration of love and commitment. Some looked sympathetic, others confused, many embarrassed to be watching such an intimate family crisis unfold. But something remarkable happened in that moment of absolute humiliation. Instead of feeling destroyed by Dad's public cruelty, I felt clarity wash over me like the golden afternoon light, filtering through the oak trees. This was who my father really was. Not the respected school principal or the concerned parent he pretended to be in public, but a man so consumed by his own failures that he would sabotage his daughter's wedding day to avoid facing them. I looked at Alex, standing beside me with protective love written across his face. I looked at Carlos, who had offered to walk me down the aisle when my own father chose gambling and theft over family support. I looked at the Martinez family members scattered throughout our guests, all of whom had shown me more unconditional love in 2 years than I'd received from my biological family in 26. Dad could stand there delivering his cruel comparisons and financial criticisms to our wedding guest. He could expose himself as the bitter, manipulative man he'd always been. He could destroy his own reputation and relationships through his public meltdown. But he couldn't destroy what Alex and I had built together, and he couldn't steal the love and support surrounding us from the people who truly mattered. The little girl who had spent decades seeking his approval was finally completely done. The woman standing at this altar in her wedding dress, surrounded by people who celebrated her success rather than resenting it, deserved so much better than anything he could offer. I stepped toward the microphone that Pastor Williams had been using for the ceremony, ready to speak my own truth to the same captive audience Dad was addressing. If he wanted to have this confrontation publicly at my wedding, in front of everyone we knew, then we were going to have it honestly and completely. The time for protecting his reputation and enabling his lies was over. The vineyard fell completely silent as I stepped toward the microphone, my wedding dress rustling against the wooden platform where Pastor Williams had been conducting our ceremony. 85 guests sat frozen in their chairs, sensing that something unprecedented was about to unfold. Dad's face went pale as he realized I wasn't retreating from his public attack. He'd expected me to crumble under his criticism the way I had throughout childhood. Instead, I was moving toward the microphone with the calm determination of someone who had finally reached her breaking point. "Since we're discussing family finances publicly, Dad, let's give our guests the complete picture," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the vineyard through the sound system. The color drained completely from his face as he understood what was happening. For years, he'd controlled family narratives through selective truth-telling and emotional manipulation. Now, in front of everyone we knew, The real story was about to be revealed. Tell them about the $45,000 you've lost, gambling at Morongo Casino over the past 18 months. Tell them about the $28,000 you embezzled from student activity funds and petty cash at Roosevelt High School. Tell them about the $8,000 you stole from my wedding account last week. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Guests gasped audibly, heads turning toward each other in shock and confusion. Some people stood up to get a better view, others leaned forward in their chairs. Mom's crying became audible across the entire venue. Dad tried to interrupt, his voice cracking with desperation. "Mia, you don't understand the complexities of the situation." But I wasn't finished. Years of suppressed truth were finally pouring out in front of the community that had respected him as an educator and trusted him with their children's welfare. Tell them why I've been working 80-hour weeks for 2 years to build my design business, not because I'm irresponsible with money, but because I've been covering bills you couldn't pay due to your gambling addiction. Tell them why you really oppose this wedding. You're terrified of losing your financial safety net when I marry someone who actually values and supports me. The transformation in our guests was remarkable. People who had arrived expecting a celebration of love and commitment were witnessing the exposure of financial crimes and family dysfunction. Some looked sympathetic toward me, others appeared angry at Dad's deception. Many seemed simply stunned by the public revelation. Alex moved to stand beside me, his presence a reminder that this confrontation was happening at our wedding on what should have been the happiest day of our lives. But his expression showed complete support for my decision to expose the truth publicly. Rachel stepped forward from her position with the bridesmaids, her lawyer instincts activated by the legal implications of Dad's public confession. She positioned herself where she could document everything happening, while also supporting me if needed. Dad made one final attempt to regain control of the narrative. "You're humiliating our entire family in front of everyone we know. This is supposed to be your wedding day, not a platform for airing personal grievances." His words revealed everything about his priorities. Even now, caught in lies and theft, he was more concerned about public embarrassment than the damage he'd caused through his criminal behavior. Carlos stepped forward then, his calm presence commanding attention from the chaotic scene. He spoke in accented English that carried the authority of someone who had built success through honest work and family dedication. "This young woman has shown more strength and integrity in the past month than most people display in a lifetime. She discovered her father's crimes and chose truth over family secrets. She deserves better than manipulation and theft disguised as parental concern." His words seemed to break Dad's remaining facade completely. The authoritative principal mask disappeared, leaving only a desperate man whose lies had finally caught up with him. "I never meant for any of this to happen," Dad said, his voice barely audible. "The gambling started as harmless recreation. When I began losing, I kept thinking I could win back what I'd lost. The school money was supposed to be temporary, just until I could recover my losses." Jessica had been recording the entire confrontation on her phone, ensuring we had evidence of Dad's public confession for the legal proceedings that would follow. Her documentation would prove crucial in the criminal case against him. Mom finally stood up from her seat, her face streaked with tears but her voice stronger than I'd heard in years. Sarah Thompson walked toward the altar, past guests who watched in stunned silence. "Dan, stop," she said firmly. "Stop blaming everyone else for choices you made. Stop using our daughter's wedding day as a platform for your justifications. You gambled away our savings. You stole from children's programs. You forged my signature. Mia didn't cause any of this." Her public acknowledgement of Dad's crimes and support of my position marked a turning point in our family dynamics. For the first time in my adult life, Mom was choosing truth over loyalty to her husband's lies. Two of Alex's cousins who worked in event security approached Dad, calmly but firmly. Without creating additional drama, they escorted him from the ceremony area toward the parking lot. His departure was quiet but definitive, ending his presence at our wedding and his role in our family. Pastor Williams, who had witnessed the entire confrontation with professional composure, stepped back to the microphone. In 30 years of conducting wedding, he'd never seen anything quite like this family crisis play out. During a ceremony, "Love requires courage," he said simply. "The courage to speak truth, to protect those we care about, and to build relationships on honesty rather than deception. Today we've witnessed that kind of courage." He gestured toward Carlos, who had remained beside me throughout the confrontation. "Would you like to continue with the ceremony as originally planned?" Carlos stepped forward, his voice warm with paternal pride. "It would be my honor to walk this remarkable young woman to her new, husband. The ceremony resumed with a different energy than we'd originally planned. What should have been a simple celebration of love had become something more complex and powerful. We were witnessing not just a wedding, but a liberation from toxic family patterns and the beginning of healthier relationships built on truth rather than manipulation. Alex and I exchanged vows that took on deeper meaning given what had just transpired. We promised to support each other through difficulties, to communicate honestly about problems, and to build our marriage on the foundation of mutual respect rather than competition or criticism. The kiss that sealed our marriage was witnessed by guests who had just seen us defend our relationship against family sabotage and choose each other despite the chaos surrounding us. During the reception that followed, something beautiful emerged from the wreckage of family confrontation. Guests approached us throughout the evening, sharing their own stories of family dysfunction, toxic relationships, and the courage required to break destructive patterns. Rachel used her legal connections to ensure Dad faced appropriate consequences while protecting our family's remaining assets. The embezzlement charges would result in his resignation from Roosevelt High criminal prosecution and mandatory restitution to the school district. Mom began the difficult process of rebuilding her life independently, finally acknowledging her role in enabling Dad's behavior and committing to making different choices going forward. Most importantly, Alex and I started our marriage with complete honesty about our families, our values, and our commitment to building something healthy together. Standing in that vineyard, surrounded by people who had witnessed our public stand for truth and dignity, I realized that sometimes the most important battles happen in the most unexpected places. Sometimes you have to expose family secrets at your own wedding to finally break free from a lifetime of manipulation and abuse. Have you ever had a moment when you finally found the courage to speak your truth, even when it meant confronting the people closest to you? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and personal integrity, between protecting someone's reputation and protecting yourself from their harmful behavior? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and share it with someone who might need to hear that their worth isn't determined by family approval or acceptance. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's destructive choices, even when that someone is your parent. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories about finding your voice, setting boundaries, and building the life you deserve. Thank you for witnessing my journey from the shadows of family favoritism to the light of authentic relationships built on truth and mutual respect. Remember, you deserve people in your life who celebrate your successes rather than resenting them, who support your dreams rather than undermining them, and who love you for who you are rather than criticizing you for who you're not. Sometimes that means creating your own family from people who choose to see and value your worth. And sometimes speaking that truth out loud changes everything.